Hey, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let me tell you a bedtime story. But fair warning, everything you're about to hear is true. Not fiction, not embellishment, not artistic lines. This is a story of a real woman who lived in France more than 3 centuries ago. A woman whose life sounds so improbable that if someone tried to write it as a novel, the editor would send the manuscript back with a note. Too much. Doesn't happen in real life. But it did. This is the Forgotten Women of History channel, a place where you can let go of the day, relax, and drift into someone else's life, like a warm current carrying you out to sea. My voice will be here beside you until you fall asleep. And if you drift off halfway through, that's perfectly time. The story will wait. It's been waiting 300 years. So, France, the end of 17th century, and the woman name is Julie d'Aubigny. Remember that name.
Paris, 1695, a royal ball at the Palais Royal, and hundreds of candles reflect in the mirrors so completely that the whole seems to burn from within. Diamonds on the necks of ladies wink at the crystal pendants of chandeliers. Violins draw out a minuet. Couples glide across the parquet with that rehearsed grace which distinguishes courtiers from ordinary people. Everything proceeds in its proper order, right up to the moment a woman in men's clothing walks in. She wears a velvet doublet of deep blue, a lace jabot, riding boots to the knee. A sword sways gently on its baldric, not a prop, not decorative, but a fighting blade with a worn leather grip that remembers other people's blood. She moves through the crowd, and people part before her, not from fear, but from the impossibility of looking away, the way one steps back from an open flame. This is Julie d'Aubigny. She is 22. She is the leading singer of the Royal Opera, and behind her trails a wake of scandals, death sentences, and broken hearts of both sexes. In 10 minutes, she will kiss a marquise full on the lips in the middle of the dance floor, before the eyes of all French high society. In 20, she will run her sword through 3 men in the palace garden. In an hour, she will return to the refreshment table, take a glass of Burgundy, and carry on with her evening as though nothing has happened. But before this ball, there stretched an entire lifetime compressed into a handful of years. Let us begin at the beginning. France, the 1670s. Versailles is still under construction, and stone dust mingles with the powder on the wigs of workers and courtiers who jostle on the same scaffolding, some below, others on the balconies. Louis XIV is at the zenith of his power, and his court is the most sophisticated school of survival in Europe. Here a compliment may prove to be poison, and a patronizing smile the harbinger of disgrace. In this milieu lives Gaston d'Aubigny, secretary to the Comte d'Armagnac, Grand Squire of France. Gaston is charged with training the royal pages, boys from noble houses who must be forged into soldiers and courtiers. His world reeks of the stable, sword oil, and cheap tobacco, and his hands are calloused from the hilt of a training blade. In 1673, Gaston has a daughter, and he makes a decision that will determine her fate more surely than any prophecy. He does not hand her over to nursemaids. He does not send her to a finishing school where girls are made into porcelain dolls fit only for marriage and embroidery. He puts little Julie in the line beside the pages between the sons of counts and viscounts. She is 10. She wears breeches stained with the dust of the fencing hall. In her hand is a rapier that seems too long for her thin frame. The adolescents around her exchange glances and smirk. A girl, what can you expect? Those smirks vanished from their faces within months. Gaston knew no mercy. Up before dawn, when cold fog still crept along the palace grounds, hours of monotonous repetition, lunge, parry, thrust, lunge again. When the steel blade left another livid mark on her body, her father said only one thing: pain is the only honest teacher. And Julie absorbed this science the way parched earth absorbs water after drought, greedily, completely, to the last drop. By 12, she no longer merely held her stance, she danced with the blade, and her movements were faster than thought. Those same pages who had laughed at her 2 years before now found any excuse not to face her in a training bout. Losing to another boy was half the trouble. Being humiliated by a girl before witnesses was something their young pride could not endure. But Gaston taught his daughter more than steel. The court of Louis XIV was a second, no less deadly field of battle. Only here the wounds were dealt with smiles and the killing was done with words. Julie learned to read people as attentively as she read an opponent's movements. She noticed who was in love with whom, who hated whom, whose career was rising and whose falling. She saw hypocrisy, saw the secret threads connecting bedchambers to throne rooms, saw how power devoured souls from within, and, being her father's daughter, she understood the cardinal rule of this world early. Among predators, you must be the most dangerous beast or cease to exist altogether. By 14, Julie had bloomed, but hers was not the porcelain doll-like beauty celebrated by court poets. In her lived a wild energy, an inner fire that could not be hidden beneath any corset or any layer of powder. Thick chestnut hair, piercing dark eyes, and hands beautiful but strong with offenses, calluses on the palms. Her father, for all his progressive ideas about education, remained a man of calculation. When his patron, the Comte d'Armagnac, turned his eye on the young beauty, Gaston did not object. The scheme had been perfected over centuries. To make a girl an official mistress while observing outward propriety, one married her off to someone compliant, spineless, and in need of money. Thus entered Julie's life the Sieur de Maupin of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a man so insignificant that history has preserved nothing about him but his surname. The wedding was performed, vows exchanged, and immediately afterward the newlywed husband received a posting somewhere in the distant south. He was gently but unmistakably given to understand his wife would remain in Paris, and visits were inadvisable. Monsieur de Maupin, obedient to fate and to the will of powerful men, climbed into a carriage and dissolved into the dust of provincial roads. Julie remained 16 years old, formally married, effectively free, but this freedom was deceptive. The role of kept woman to an aging count proved a cage no less confining than marriage. Luxurious chambers, predictable dinners, boredom corroding the soul like rust corrodes an unused blade, and then Serrans appeared in her life. A fencing master, one of the finest blades in Paris, a man with a dark past and a still darker future. an adventurer for whom each day might be his last. When they first crossed swords in the fencing hall, what passed between them was not a spark, but a bolt of lightning. Their bouts resembled a lover's overture. So thoroughly did passion and steel, closeness and danger intertwine. Paris immediately began to whisper. The Comte d'Armagnac's mistress was openly spending time with some fencing instructor. For the court, this was unheard of audacity. To defy one's protector was to defy the very order of things. But the thunder came not from gossip. Serain, being hot-blooded and incapable of backing down, got into a duel and killed his opponent. And duels under Louis XIV were punished by death, without exceptions or caveats. The hunt was on, and he needed to vanish from Paris immediately if he valued his head. And here Julie committed her first act that truly determined the rest of her life. She could have stayed. She had everything: chambers, money, patronage. She could have sighed with feigned sadness, dried her tearless eyes, and found a new lover by evening. Any sensible woman would have done so. Julie put on a man's doublet, tucked her hair beneath a broad-brimmed hat, buckled a sword to her hip, and stepped through the gates into the night road. Madame de Maupin ceased to exist. On the roads of France appeared a bold young cavalier with a sharp gaze and a sharper blade. They galloped away from the capital on back roads by night, and the drumming of hoofs drowned out every former sound of her life, the minuets, the compliments, the rustle of silk. Ahead lay nothing certain, no money, no roof, no future, only the road leading south, where the long arm of the Parisian police grew shorter and the law grew softer. But one must eat every day, even on the run, and they began to earn by the only trade they both knew: a dusty square in a provincial town, market day. A crowd gathers in a circle. Peasants, garrison soldiers, idle gawkers. Serain steps into the center and announces in a carrying voice that his young companion is ready to cross blades with any brave soul for a handful of coins. Local toughs size up the slender youth with a lazy smirk and step forward, anticipating easy sport. And then the show begins. Julie played with them like a cat plays with a mouse it cannot be bothered to kill. She let them attack, slipped their blows with languid grace, and then a flurry of lightning thrusts, and suddenly a hat flies off a head, a sword clatters from a nerveless hand, and the man stands red-faced with shame, unable to comprehend how this boy manages to be everywhere at once. But the real payoff came at the finale, when Julie pulled off her hat and chestnut hair spilled over her shoulders. The crowd erupted. The victor is a woman. Coins rained at her feet like a downpour after long drought. So the months of vagabond life unwound. Julie learned to sleep under open sky without flinching at the cold, to groom horses without minding the smell, to mend clothing by the fire with fingers stiff from exhaustion. But above all, she tasted absolute freedom, and that taste proved sweet to the point of vertigo. Men's clothing gave her what she had been denied from birth by the mere fact of her sex. The right to enter anywhere, to say anything, to look anyone straight in the eye without lowering her gaze or hiding behind a fan. Yet Serain was dimming beside her, slowly but inexorably, like a candle beside a bonfire. His jealousy, his pettiness, his fear of pursuit, all of it began to grate on Julie, who neither knew how nor wished to restrain herself. She drew more attention. Her talent burned brighter, and between them there opened first a crack, then a gap, then a chasm. By the time they reached Marseille, that port city boiling with life, where the languages, cultures, and vices of the entire Mediterranean mingled, Julie already knew their story was finished. She had outgrown her companion the way a tree outgrows its stake. Ahead of her waited an encounter that would drive her to commit a crime far worse than any duel, one for which, in those times, the punishment was burning at the stake. In Marseille, still living in male guise, Julie fell in love. Suddenly, devastatingly, as only those who know no half measures can. But the object of her passion was not some new adventurer with a shadowy past. It was a girl, the daughter of a wealthy Marseille merchant, gentle and sheltered, raised among lace and domestic comfort. Julie's polar opposite, and perhaps for that very reason, so magnetic. Julie courted her as a man with that desperate boldness which made her irresistible regardless of sex. The girl returned her feelings, and when the truth finally emerged and the mask fell, she did not recoil, did not scream. On the contrary, what was forbidden became only more irresistible for it. But in a city where walls have ears and neighbors have long tongues, the secret did not hold for long. Rumors reached the parents. Respectable bourgeois for whom reputation was dearer than life itself, they were seized by horror bordering on madness. Their daughter and a vagabond swordswoman dressed as a man? This was not merely a scandal, it was a catastrophe capable of destroying the family in the eyes of all Marseille. They acted decisively. The girl was sent to the convent of the Visitandines in Avignon. High walls, iron grills, prayers from dawn to dusk. A reliable prison for the soul, so they believed. And they were certain they had placed a final, emphatic full stop on this story. They did not know whom they were dealing with. For Julie d'Aubigny, the word impossible had always sounded like an invitation to try. She traveled to Avignon. She approached the convent gates, but not with sword drawn, not with a torch in hand. No, she played her finest performance to date. She appeared before the abbess as a repentant sinner, weary of the wicked world and thirsting to serve the Lord in quiet devotion. Eyes downcast, voice meek, hands folded in prayer, she was accepted as a postulant. The wolf entered the sheepfold softly and bowed its head. Behind those walls, Julie found her beloved, and there began stolen meetings in dark corridors, whispers during services, notes hidden inside prayer books. But simply fleeing was impossible. The walls were too high, the gates locked day and night. The postulants watched without cease. She needed chaos, real, all-consuming chaos in which one could dissolve without a trace. And fate, as though conspiring with her, tossed Julie an opportunity. An elderly nun died in the convent, a commonplace event. Death was a frequent visitor in such places. But in Julie Izu's mind, this fact transformed into a scheme for which, in the 17th century, one was burned at the stake without hesitation. Sacrilege, desecration of a body, arson of a holy house. On the night before the burial, when the convent had sunk into sleep and only a solitary candle flickered before the altar, Julie slipped from her cell, stone corridors, dank and echoing, her own breathing the only sound. She reached the body and hoisted the dead nun onto her shoulders. Picture this, a young woman hauling a corpse through an entire convent in pitch darkness, stumbling over uneven flagstones, every rustle threatening discovery. She dragged the body to her beloved cell and laid it on the bed, covered it with the blanket, and then set fire to the room. The flames caught instantly. Dry wood, straw mattresses, threadbare curtains, all ignited at once. Smoke poured into the corridors. Screaming, the clanging of bells, the slap of bare feet on stone. Nuns ran in panic, thinking only of escape. It occurred to no one to count the postulants. Everyone was certain the poor girl had perished in the blaze. In that chaos, and amid the smoke, the flames, and the cries, two figures cleared the convent wall and melted into the night as though they had never been. For 3 months they wandered the roads, drunk on freedom and each other. But life is not a minstrel's ballad, and romantic fever sooner or later gives way to the mundane. The merchant's daughter, accustomed to soft beds and hot meals, was not made for a fugitive's existence, and Julie grew bored. That all-consuming passion which had driven her to madness burned out as swiftly as it had ignited. The girl for whom she had torched a convent and desecrated a corpse ceased to be interesting. Julie sent her home, back to her parents, back to her former life of lace and prayers, and walked on without looking back. The parents, naturally, were stunned. Their daughter was alive, and in the burned cell lay a stranger's remains. The investigation was swift. The court at Aix-en-Provence passed sentence in absentia. Julie d'Aubigny, known as Mademoiselle de Maupin, was condemned to death by burning at the stake. Any normal person would have burrowed into a hole and trembled for the rest of their days. Julie set out for Paris. On the road north, in some backwater tavern reeking of sour wine and burn dripping, a man named Maréchal heard her sing. He was a musician with a keen ear and an empty purse. Julie was singing for a few coins, something simple, common, the sort of thing sailors bellow in harbor dives. But her contralto, low and rich, filled the smoke-thick room so completely that rough men at their tables froze with mugs halfway to their lips. Maréchal approached her afterward, still taking her for a young man. "You don't belong in taverns. A voice like yours belongs at the Royal Academy of Music." Julie, a fugitive criminal under sentence of death, laughed out loud, but the seed fell on prepared ground. Maréchal became her first true vocal teacher. He showed her how to harness that extraordinary voice, how not to strain it, how to transform a gift of nature into a controlled instrument. Their brief affair was less passion than mutual admiration between two people who spoke the language of music. After parting from Maréchal, Julie found a new companion, a young tenor named Gabriel Vincent Thévenard, also dreaming of the Parisian stage. Together, like two tributaries of the same river, they reached the capital in 1690. Julie was 17. Behind her already lay a marriage, a flight, duels, arson, desecration, and a death sentence. A life that would have sufficed for 10 people, and it had barely begun. One small detail remained. How does one enter the opera when the police are searching for you? Julie went to the Comte d'Armagnac, her former protector, the man she had abandoned and betrayed years before. It was pure risk. The Comte could have handed her over without a second thought. But Julie knew men, knew their weaknesses, their vanity, their inability to resist what had once belonged to them. She was not wrong. The Comte not only did not betray her, he secured her an audience with the king himself. Louis XIV heard the tale in a sanitized version, naturally omitting the details about the nun's corpse, and laughed heartily. He liked this madwoman, and with a stroke of his pen, he gave her life anew, the death sentence annulled, the past forgotten. That same year, Mademoiselle de Maupin made her debut at the Royal Academy of Music in Lully's opera Cadmus et Hermione, the role of Pallas Athena, a goddess in gleaming armor. When she sang, the audience forgot how to breathe. Her contralto was unlike anything heard before, low, velvety, almost masculine in depth, yet shot through with a sensuality that gripped the heart. Critics fell over themselves. The most beautiful voice in the world. Paris, that same Paris from which she had fled by night with a condemned killer, fell at her feet. Now let us return to the ball where our story began, because now we know who this woman in the blue doublet is and what stands behind her every gesture. By 1695, Julie was a recognized star whose name was spoken in whispers and with bated breath simultaneously. Tickets to her performances vanished the day they went on sale. People came not merely to hear music, they came to see a living legend, knowing that her every appearance might turn into something unpredictable. She was unbearable and magnificent in her unbearableness. She quarreled with theater directors, demanded higher fees, rewrote her parts when she felt a composer had failed to exploit the full range of her voice. And they yielded, because without her, the box office lost half its receipts. Off stage, she still wore men's clothing and a sword, and used the latter for more than ornament. The affair with the tenor Dumenil became proverbial. When he insulted a chorus girl Julie was fond of, she ambushed him after a performance, drew her blade, and demanded satisfaction. Dumenil, who played heroes on stage, proved a coward in life. He blanched and refused to fight. Julie regarded him for a moment, slid her sword back into its scabbard, and proceeded to beat him with her walking stick in the middle of the square. As a parting gesture, she relieved him of his watch and snuff-box, trophies of war. The next day, when Dumenil informed the company that he had been set upon by a gang of robbers, 10 men at least, Julie entered the room, produced his watch from her pocket, and said with icy composure, "There was no gang. There was me and my stick." And now, the ball at the Palais Royal, the men's costume, the dance with the marquise, the kiss before all eyes. 3 offended noblemen bar her path. "We demand satisfaction." Julie removes her doublet, stands in her white shirt washed in moonlight. "One at a time or all together, as you prefer, gentlemen." The first bout lasted a minute. A thrust to the shoulder, and the nobleman dropped his sword. The second hurled himself at her in fury, trying to overwhelm her with heavy cutting blows. Julie circled him, light as a shadow, waiting for her moment, and when he opened himself for an instant, her blade stung his thigh. The third, the shortest bout, a feint, a disarmament, the point at his throat. Life or death? Life. She wiped her blade on the grass, put on her doublet, straightened her jabot, and returned to the ballroom. Not a single scratch, not a speck of blood on her lace. She took a glass of Burgundy from a bewildered footman and drank, gazing over the heads of the crowd toward the orchestra, which had stumbled for a moment and now resumed its minuet. But a duel on the grounds of a royal palace was no prank, no anecdote for the salons. It was a crime against the state, and even the king's patronage had its limits. Julie found herself outside the law once more, and once more she had to flee. This time not as an unknown girl, but as a celebrity whose face was known to all Paris. She went to Brussels, where she became the mistress of Maximilian, the second Emmanuel, Elector of Bavaria, one of the most powerful men in Europe. A safe harbor, it seemed, a wealthy protector, luxury, security, but Julie could not be tamed. When after several months the elector, wearied by her volcanic temperament, proposed they part, and offered her 40,000 francs as a farewell gift, she flew into a rage. 40,000, an entire fortune, enough to live in comfort for the rest of one's life. Julie hurled the money in his face. "You think," she hissed, you can dismiss me like a servant with severance pay." And she left, empty-handed, with a pride worth more than any sum. From Brussels she drifted to Madrid and worked as a maid to a countess, languished, withered. The great La Maupin Azam, servant in a foreign house. It was unbearable, and so she wrote a letter, the addressee, Louis XIV, King of France. This letter deserves to be carved in stone as a monument to human audacity. Julie did not beg, did not repent, did not plead for mercy. She constructed an argument, cold and flawless as a blade. "Sire, your edicts forbid duels between noblemen. I, however, am a woman. Therefore the law concerning duelists does not apply to me, and I have committed nothing unlawful." Louis XIV, upon receiving this missive, laughed for the second time in their strange long-distance relationship. Perhaps he simply enjoyed pardoning beautiful madwomen. Perhaps he valued wit and fearlessness above obedience. In any case, he pardoned her again. A second time in one lifetime, a case without precedent in the entire history of the French monarchy. The road to Paris lay open. From 1698 to 1705, Julie reigned over the stage without rival. And these were years when the opera itself seemed to exist for her sake. Composers shaped themselves to her voice the way a river shapes itself to its bed. André Campra wrote for her the role of Clorinda in Tancred. A Saracen warrior woman who wears men's armor, fights alongside knights, and dies at the hand of her beloved who fails to recognize her beneath the visor. When Julie first performed this role, the audience fell into a peculiar taut silence. Everyone understood they were watching not an actress in character, but a woman living out her own fate under another name. Clorinda's death aria in her rendition brought tears even to those who had come to the theatre solely to gossip during the interval. By then, Julie's voice had grown deeper, richer. Into it had woven overtones of tragedy absent in her youth. The years of wandering, dueling, and loss had entered her singing and made it something larger than mere music. She was the highest paid artist at the opera, but money flowed through her fingers like water. Feasts for the entire company, gifts for lovers of both sexes, alms for beggars at the theatre entrance. She saved nothing, as though she knew at some deep level that saving was pointless. Her colleagues regarded her with that peculiar feeling which arises when admiration and fear are fused into one. Working alongside La Maupin was like sitting on a powder keg. She might halt a rehearsal over the conductor's tempo, stage a jealous scene in mid-performance, or hurl a prop halberd at a colleague who allowed himself an ill-judged joke. The shaft buried itself in the scenery an inch from his temple. "Next time," she said without raising her voice, "I won't miss." No one joked in her presence after that. And yet these were the happiest years of her life. not because everything went smoothly, but because she finally occupied the place in the world for which she had been made. Her men's costumes became fashionable. Ladies of the highest society ordered doublets à la Maupin, though they dared wear them only at masquerades. Julie wore hers every day, and it was not a pose, not a provocation, simply herself, as she had always been. In 1703, Julie met the Marquise de Florensac, and everything before suddenly seemed merely a prelude to this encounter. This was not another flash, not the hunter's thrill, not the desire to possess. The Marquise was a woman of rare, quiet beauty, the kind that does not strike the eye but reveals itself gradually, like a sunrise. Contemporaries called her the most beautiful woman in Paris, and in the mouths of people jaded by beauty, that meant a great deal. She was soft where Julie was sharp, calm where Julie blazed, and she possessed that particular inner light which cannot be counterfeited. Julie, who had spent her entire life at war with the world and herself, laid down her arms for the first time. She no longer needed duels, scandals, wild escapades, all those things with which she had drowned out an inner emptiness. One smile from the Marquise gave her more than the ovation of an entire hall. They lived together openly, concealing nothing, two women in the middle of early 18th century Paris, where such a thing could destroy you. But Julie's authority, multiplied by the Marquise's high position, created an invisible fortress around them that no one dared storm. Every evening, standing on stage at the end of an aria, Julie found with her eyes one single box, met one single gaze, and that was enough for all the rest of the world. The 1,000 faces in the stalls, the glare of the footlights, the thunder of applause, to recede and dissolve, leaving only the two of them. 2 years of absolute unalloyed happiness. 2 years for which perhaps it was worth living through all the rest, all the chaos, all the pain, all the madness. And then the Marquise fell ill. The fever came insidiously, first a slight warmth, then chills, then days when she could not rise from bed. The medicine of the 18th century knew only bloodletting and prayers, and neither helped. Julie did not leave her side. She who had feared neither man nor law nor the devil himself now faced for the first time an enemy that could be neither outwitted nor defeated nor intimidated. She sat at the bedside and held the Marquise's weakening hand in her own, those same hands with the fencer's calluses, hands that could kill a man in 10 seconds and that now were more useless than a child's. The Marquise de Florensac died in Julie's arms, and in that moment something went out, that furious fire which had burned inside Julie since birth, which had driven her down roads, hurled her over convent walls, raised her sword against 3 men at once. It went out quietly and finally, like a candle that no one has blown out, but which has simply guttered to its end. After the Marquise's death, Julie still tried to live as before. In 1705, she took the stage one last time, in La Vénitienne by Michel de la Barre. Her voice sounded as flawless as ever. The contralto filled the hall to the highest gallery. Not a single note faltered. But the audience, especially those who had known her a long time, sensed the substitution, as though what sang was not a living person, but a magnificent mechanism from which the soul had been removed. The eyes that once had burned with that frightening magnetic fire now gazed through the hall toward a place the living cannot follow. After the final bow, she left the stage and never returned. She was 32, the age at which an opera singer's voice is only entering its full power, but there was no longer anyone to sing for, nor any reason. She sold everything: costumes, jewelry, swords, those same blades that had drunk other people's blood and saved her life. She gave the money away to the poor, to the church, to former colleagues in need. These were not gestures of generosity, but the systematic shedding of everything that tied her to her former existence, the way a dying person throws off blankets that have suddenly become unbearably heavy. There is a moment of strange, piercing tenderness in this story. Julie wrote to her husband, that same Sieur de Maupin, the pliant man she had abandoned on their wedding day and not seen in 20 years. She did not ask forgiveness, she never could, but he came, a quiet, no longer young man who had spent his entire life in the shadow of her madness. He asked nothing, reproached nothing, presented no bills, simply stood beside her, the only person in the world who wanted nothing from her. Their reunion was brief. Julie had already made her decision, the last of her life, and perhaps the most astonishing of all. She entered a convent. She who had burned a convent, desecrated a corpse, and stolen a postulant, voluntarily crossed the threshold of a religious house and took vows. An irony that takes one's breath away. But for Julie, it was neither irony nor penance for show. It was the only place where the world could finally fall silent. Bare stone walls, a crucifix, a narrow, hard bed, hours on her knees in prayer. She who had never been able to stand still now spent hours motionless, hands folded, gazing at the flame of a solitary candle. That voice before which Paris had fallen silent now sounded only in the convent choir. And the nun standing beside her must have wondered where this gaunt woman with the empty gaze had found such an impossible, such inhumanly beautiful contralto. But Julie no longer sang for them, not for audiences, not for lovers, perhaps for God, or perhaps for the Marquise, who could hear her from a place no voice can reach. Her body faded rapidly. The years lived at breaking point presented their bill. She was 33, the age of Christ, the age at which most people are only beginning to understand what they want from life. Julie, by that age, had already lived several lives and grown weary of each. In 1707, in the silence of a convent cell, her heart stopped. She was buried simply, as nuns are buried, without grand processions, without speeches at the graveside. The location of her grave has been lost to time, and no one knows where the remains lie of the most scandalous, most free, most unfree woman of her age. Perhaps that is as it should be. She needs no monument of stone. Stone is too still, too heavy, too dead to hold her memory. Her monument is her life itself. 33 years, and into them was packed enough to fill a novel in 10 volumes, each volume of which would seem an exaggeration were it not confirmed by documents of the period. She mastered the sword better than most professional duelists, men who had devoted their entire lives to the blade. She fled Paris with a condemned killer. She earned her living in street fights. She stole her beloved from a convent by substituting a corpse and setting fire to the building. Twice she received a death sentence, and twice was pardoned by the king. She became the greatest opera singer of her era. She defeated 3 armed men in 10 minutes without receiving a scratch. She flung a fortune in the face of one of the rulers of Europe. She loved men and women, openly, fiercely, without asking anyone's permission, and she left this life as a nun, in silence and prayer. She was neither heroine nor villain, because both those roles are too small for her. She was a force of nature, the kind that does not submit to human measure and will not fit inside any frame. One may admire her. One may be horrified by what she did. One may ask, was this freedom or destruction, rebellion or illness, strength or an inability to stop? There is no definitive answer, and perhaps that is her true legacy. She left behind no moral, taught no lesson, bequeathed no rules for living. She simply lived her own life, as she wished, in an age when a woman was not permitted to wish at all. And that is enough to remember her 300 years on.